The wind moved slow over the red hills of northern Arizona, dragging dust like an old memory. The telegraph wire hummed quietly, one lonely note stretched across miles of nothing. Sheriff Alan Darkwolf hadn't worn a badge in 6 years. Not since Hawksford turned its back on him. They hadn't said it out loud, not all at once, but they never had to. A half-Apache lawman was useful when things were bad, when outlaws came howling. But once peace settled and the streets were safe, so were their old fears. He'd handed in the Tin Star himself, walked out without asking for thanks, and he never looked back. Until the wire came. Sarah in danger, outlaw returned. Need you, just 5 words. But one name, Sarah, was enough. Alan stood alone at the canyon edge, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other gripping that yellow slip of paper. The sky was starting to burn orange behind him. He folded the wire carefully, slid it into his coat. Then he swung up onto his horse and turned back toward the place that once rejected him. Not for justice, not for glory. This time he was riding back for the only soul who'd ever seen him. Not the badge, not the blood, just him. Sarah. Alan Darkwolf rode into Hawksford at dawn, just as the sun began peeling back the shadows from the storefronts. The town hadn't changed much. Same cracked boardwalk, same leaning church steeple, same dry wind that never stayed still. But Alan had. He'd spent 6 years with the silence of the high mesas, breaking wild mustangs and fixing fence lines that ran farther than memory. He'd grown quieter, harder. The boyish sharpness in his features had given way to carved lines and a quiet stillness that came from being forgotten. As he passed the sheriff's office, the chair out front creaked. Old man Dorsey sat there chewing a piece of straw like he'd been born with it. Dorsey squinted. Well, I'll be damned. Thought we buried you with the old jail door. Alan didn't stop. You'll have to try harder next time. That got a chuckle from Dorsey, dry as a rusted hinge. Folks on the street slowed. Some stared. A woman tugged her child's arm away from the road. A store clerk froze mid-sweep. Alan kept riding. They didn't need to say a word. He could feel it in the air, the same mix of suspicion and shame that had clung to him like dust the day he left. Sarah Whitlow's house sat just past the livery, up a hill overlooking the valley. He remembered that view. She used to say it reminded her of freedom, something you could see but never quite touch. Alan dismounted slowly, tied his horse to the post, and stood for a moment, listening. The house looked lived in. Curtains moved gently with the breeze. A rocking chair sat still on the porch, a shawl draped over one arm like someone had left in a hurry. He climbed the steps, knocked once, no answer. Sarah, he called. The silence that answered was heavier than he liked. He tried the door. Unlocked. Inside, the house smelled like old tea and cedar. The parlor was clean but not polished. Dishes sat drying in a rack. A book lay open on the table. But Sarah wasn't there. Alan moved through the house slowly, each room creaking with memory. He saw the writing desk near the window where she used to scribble poems she never let anyone read. The iron bed she once insisted didn't need fixing, even when it sagged. The picture frames, empty now, lined up along the mantel. Then he saw the telegram, still sitting by the lamp, unfolded. To Alan Darkwolf, Sarah in danger. Outlaw returned. Need you. His own name staring back at him. Someone had sent it, but Sarah hadn't read it. That meant one thing. She was already gone when it arrived. Outside, footsteps crunched on gravel. Alan turned fast, hand near the revolver at his hip, but stopped short. It was a boy, thin, maybe 12, eyes too old for his face. You're Sheriff Darkwolf, the boy said. Not a question. Alan lowered his hand. Who's asking? The boy squared his shoulders. Name's Mikey Dawson. My pa's the one Cutter killed last week. Alan stiffened. You saw it. I was in the barn, heard everything. Alan studied him. Dirty boots, bruised forearm. No weapon, just a slingshot and a piece of rope tied at the belt. You sent the wire. Mikey nodded. Why? The boy looked straight at him. 'Cause no one else here is going to stand up to Cutter. But my pa said once, you did. Alan felt something cold settle in his chest. He told me, if anything ever happened, and the law here was too scared to move. Find Alan Darkwolf. The boy's lip trembled, but he held it still. So I did. Alan sighed and leaned against the porch post. Where's Sarah? Mikey hesitated. I seen her last at the church. She was looking for help. Next day, her husband, Tom Whitlow, was found dead out near Widow's Gulch. Alan looked away, jaw tightening. She disappeared after that, Mikey added. Some say Cutter took her. Others say she ran. Alan's voice was low. And what do you think? The boy shrugged. I think she waited for you. That night, Alan stayed at Sarah's. He lit no lamps, cooked nothing, just sat by the window, eyes on the dark hills beyond the ridge. The wind had changed. It carried the scent of smoke. He knew what that meant. Someone was sending a message. At dawn, Mikey returned with a loaf of bread and a tin of beans. I ain't got a gun, he said, setting them down on the porch. But I can help. I can listen. I can scout. Alan raised an eyebrow. Scout? I know these hills better than most grown men. Alan considered him. And what'll your ma say about that? She's dead too, the boy said, like he was telling the weather. Alan nodded once. Then you help, but you follow my rules. No fights, no guns, no hero stuff. Mikey grinned. Deal. Together they rode out to Widow's Gulch. The ground was dry and torn, sagebrush scorched, buzzards circled a ridge above. Alan dismounted, crouched, and studied the soil. Tracks, 3 men, 1 woman, struggle, drag marks. He placed his hand flat on the dirt. She was taken, he said. Mikey swallowed hard. You think she's still alive? Alan stood slowly, dusting off his palms. She better be. Then he looked to the boy. Time to find Cutter. By noon, the sun had scorched away the shadows. Alan and Mikey rode side by side, the boy on a stubborn mule borrowed from the blacksmith. It limped slightly, but Mikey didn't complain. He sat straight in the saddle, like someone twice his age, one hand on the reins, the other clutching a small field journal wrapped in twine. You keep notes? Alan asked, eyes scanning the trail. Mikey nodded. Pa taught me. Said every detail's a clue if you pay attention. Alan almost smiled. Good man, your father. Mikey's jaw tightened. He was. They rode in silence for a while, the trail narrowing into broken shale. Hawksford disappeared behind them, nothing but rock and sky ahead. They reached the bluffs by mid-afternoon. The land dropped into a narrow ravine, deep and steep, the kind of place you don't go unless you've got something to hide. Mikey dismounted first, crouched near a brush pile, and pointed. Boot prints, he said. Alan followed. Sure enough, 3 pairs, heavy, fresh. One smaller, dragged slightly. Sarah. Alan stared at the tracks, heart clenching. You think she's hurt? Mikey asked. She's alive, Alan said. Or they wouldn't be hiding. They followed the trail on foot. Alan took the lead, Mikey close behind, quieter than most grown men he'd known. Every now and then, Alan stopped to scan the landscape, then turned to quiz the boy. What direction they turnin'? East, toward the river bend. Why? Trees, water. Cover. Alan nodded. You're learning. By dusk, they reached the edge of Cutter's old hideout, an abandoned stage stop, half rotten, leaning into the hillside like a secret trying not to be found. Alan crouched behind a rock outcrop. Mikey slid in beside him. 3 horses, 2 men at the fire, a woman tied near the post, 1 more man inside. Sarah, Mikey whispered. Alan looked through his spyglass. Her hair was longer, her face older, but her back was still straight, her eyes still sharp. She hadn't been broken. Is it them? Mikey asked. Alan didn't answer right away. Then, it's him. Wade Cutter. Alan had sent him to prison years ago for robbery, murder, and something worse that no jury had words for. Rumor had it he'd escaped the gallows by turning on his own gang. Hawksford had been quiet since, until now. Mikey turned to Alan. We go down there? Alan shook his head. Not yet. Too many of them. Not enough of us. But she's right there. I know, Mikey gritted his teeth. If I was older, you're not, Alan said firmly. And that's not a weakness. It's a shield. The boy's eyes burned. He killed my father. Alan's voice softened. And you're not going to throw your life away trying to be the kind of man your father wouldn't want you to be. That stopped Mikey cold. Alan pulled out a map. We'll wait till nightfall. They'll get lazy. When one leaves for watch, we go around the ridge, flank the back. And me? You keep watch. If anything goes wrong, you ride to Dorsey. Tell him I'm dead, and Sarah's still breathing. Mikey frowned. You trust Dorsey? I trust you more. Night fell, fast and black. They waited until the fire dimmed and the camp stilled. Alan moved like a shadow. Mikey stayed behind, crouched near the mule, fists balled in his lap. Every sound made his heart pound, but he stayed still, just like Alan taught him. At the camp, Alan crept behind the stable, knife in hand. He took out the sentry fast. Just a choke and a thud. No blood, no noise. He reached Sarah just as she looked up. Her eyes widened, but she didn't scream. Alan, she whispered. In the flesh, he said, cutting her binds. You shouldn't have come, she said, and they'll kill you. You sent for me. I didn't, she said. Mikey did. Alan froze. Your note came too late. Tom's dead. I know. They locked eyes. Years collapsed into seconds. Then, can you walk? I can run. They moved back toward the ridge, but a crunch of gravel behind them froze the air. Cutter, tall, mean-eyed, a scar across his neck like lightning on bark. Well, hell, he drawled. Ain't this a reunion? Alan stepped in front of Sarah. Let her go. Cutter smiled. Thought they hung you in silence. Guess I'll have to do the job myself. Behind him, the other men stirred. Alan raised his hands. You want me? Fine. But she walks. No deal, Cutter said. Then came a voice from the ridge. Hey! Cutter turned. Mikey, standing tall, hands cupped around his mouth. I told the town sheriff everything. They're coming. Fast. He hadn't, but Cutter didn't know that. Damn kid, he hissed. That was all the opening Alan needed. He tackled Cutter hard. The two men hit the ground, fists flying. Sarah grabbed a loose board and swung at the second outlaw. He staggered back, dazed. Mikey scrambled down the ridge, grabbing Sarah's hand. Come on! Alan landed a punch that knocked Cutter against the post. The outlaw reached for his gun, but Alan kicked it away. Still think I'm half a man? Alan growled. Cutter spat blood. You're half-breed. That's worse. Alan's fist silenced him. For good. When it was over, Alan stood in the silence, breathless. Sarah touched his arm. Thank you. He nodded, chest heaving. Don't thank me. Thank the boy. They looked to Mikey, sweaty, shaking, eyes wide, but alive. They rode back at first light, 3 on horseback, no words, no regrets. Hawksford was waking up as they returned. Dorsey stood at the edge of the street, arms crossed. Well, well, he muttered. Didn't think you'd come back. Alan slid off his horse. Didn't come back for you. Sarah dismounted, hand on Mikey's shoulder. The boy stood tall between them. The sun was rising when they reached the Whitlow place, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The front gate was broken. A shutter hung loose on one hinge. The chickens Sarah had once kept were gone, and the garden was overtaken with weeds. Alan helped her down from the horse. Mikey followed, boots crunching the dry dirt beneath him. Sarah stood still a long moment, staring at the porch. Her hand hovered just above her hip, where her wedding ring used to sit. You don't have to go in, Alan said quietly. She nodded. I do. Mikey reached out without saying anything, and she took his hand. The door creaked open, heavy with memory. Sunlight spilled into a house that had been frozen in time. The table still held 2 empty cups, one chair pulled back, one plate never washed. Sarah stepped over the threshold, walked to the kitchen, touched the edge of the counter like it might wake something. Then softly, they killed him in the dark. He never even saw them coming. Alan lowered his head. He wasn't a bad man, she said, but he wasn't a fighter. He never wanted a gun in the house. Mikey stood in the doorway, fists clenched at his sides. I'm sorry, Alan said. Sarah looked back. So am I. They buried Tom behind the barn, next to a row of peach trees that had long since gone dry. Mikey helped dig, said nothing. When it was done, Sarah placed a stone at the head and tied one of her scarves around it. The wind caught it gently, lifting it like a flag of surrender. They stood there in silence. 3 people in a grave, each with their own ghost. Then Mikey said, "I want to stay here." Sarah turned. "This house isn't—" "It's not about the house," the boy said. "It's about not running." Alan glanced at Sarah. She looked at him the same way she did years ago, when he'd taken a bullet to protect a banker's wife and bled all over her porch. "You're really not going to leave again, are you?" she asked. Alan shook his head. "Not unless you tell me to." That night they lit the stove, cooked potatoes and beans, didn't talk much, but there was a rhythm to the way they moved. Sarah knew where the tin plates were. Alan brought in wood before she asked. Mikey sat at the table, back straight, eyes wide, soaking it all in. It wasn't peace yet, but it was a beginning. 2 days later, Alan returned to town to face what he thought would be a storm. But Dorsey just gave a tired nod and muttered, "Looks like you did our job for us." Alan stepped into the sheriff's office and placed an envelope on the desk. Inside, a written account of Cutter's return, the attempted kidnapping, the killing. Legal? Clean. Dorsey raised an eyebrow. "You gonna wear the badge again?" Alan paused. "No," he said. "I didn't think so. But if trouble comes, I'll be ready." He returned to the ranch by sundown. Sarah was on the porch with a needle and thread. Mikey was trying to fix the broken gate, one bent nail at a time. When Alan approached, the boy looked up. "You ever fix a fence before?" Mikey asked. Alan smiled. "Couple 100 miles of it." Mikey handed him a hammer. "Then you can help." That evening they sat by the fire. Sarah mended an old blanket. Mikey leaned against Alan's side, the boy half asleep. "I never asked," Sarah said. "Where'd you go all these years?" Alan stared into the flames. "Nowhere special, just far enough not to feel unwanted." "You always were wanted," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Only by one person?" A long pause. Then she asked the question that had lingered in the air since the moment he rode back. "Why didn't you write?" Alan's jaw tensed. "I didn't think I had the right," he said. "Not after what they did to me. Not after what I didn't do to stop them." She nodded slowly. "Maybe you didn't," she whispered. "But you do now." Later that night, after Mikey had gone to sleep, Alan found Sarah sitting on the porch steps, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The stars were bright, endless, and silent. He sat beside her, knees brushing. "Thank you for still being here," he said. She gave a small smile. "I wasn't waiting. I was surviving." "That's more than most." She turned to him. "I'm tired, Alan." "I know. I don't want to survive anymore. I want to live." Alan took her hand, calloused and warm. "Then let's live," he said, "together." In the weeks that followed, the Whitlow place came back to life. Mikey built a birdhouse and painted it crooked. Sarah planted herbs in broken jars. Alan fixed the roof, the well, and, slowly, his place in their lives. They didn't call it a family, but it felt like one. One morning, Mikey came into the kitchen with his notebook. He held it out to Alan. "I've been writing about you," he said. Alan raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "School assignment," Mikey said. "Tell about a man who changed your life." Alan was quiet for a long time. Then, "Am I the hero or the villain?" Mikey grinned. "You're both." Alan laughed. "That sounds about right." The storm came without warning. Not in the sky, though the clouds were darkening, but in the form of a rider pounding down the ridge, dust chasing his heels. Alan was working in the barn when he heard the hooves. He stepped out, hay on his sleeves, and met the messenger halfway. The boy slid from the saddle wide-eyed, breath ragged. "They're back," he said. "Cutter's men." Alan's gut twisted. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. They came through the pass last night, took supplies from the trading post, shot the clerk in the leg." The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. "Said they were looking for the half-breed and the woman he stole." Alan didn't waste time. By the time the sun set, he'd checked the rifles, counted the rounds, locked the barn, and moved Sarah and Mikey inside. The windows were shuttered, the doors barred. "I thought Cutter was the last of them," Sarah said, voice tight. "He was the head, Alan replied. But snakes don't always die with the head. He turned to Mikey. You remember what we talked about? The boy nodded. No hero stuff. No guns. Run when you say run. Alan rested a hand on his shoulder. That's right. You see a break in the trees, you take it. Straight to town. You tell Dorsey everything. Mikey frowned. He won't believe me. Alan looked him in the eyes. He will, because you'll make him. That night, the wind picked up. Alan sat by the window, Henry rifle across his lap. He could feel it in his bones. They were close. Sarah moved quietly through the kitchen, candlelight brushing her face. She'd pulled her hair back, wore the same shawl she'd wrapped around Tom's grave. She looked calm. She wasn't. I won't lose another man to them, she said. You won't, Alan said, eyes on the dark outside. A beat passed. Sarah walked over, knelt beside him, took his hand. If something happens, it won't. Alan, he looked at her, and for the first time since he'd returned, his voice cracked. I only just got you back. Don't make me waste time planning how to lose you. They didn't sleep. By morning, the storm clouds had broken, but no rain came, just heat, dust, and distant hoofbeats. Alan opened the front door and stepped out. Sarah stood behind him, Mikey on the stairs. 4 riders crested the ridge, dirty, scarred, armed. The lead man raised his hand. Dark Wolf, he shouted. We came for what you stole. Alan took 1 step forward. You got nothing left to take. The man grinned. We'll see. He lifted his hand, and everything happened at once. Gunfire cracked like lightning. Alan rolled behind the water trough. Bullets bit into the porch post. Sarah pulled Mikey down into the hallway. The barn door blew open. A horse screamed. Alan returned fire. 2 quick shots, 1 man down. Mikey covered his ears. Stay down, Sarah shouted, pulling him behind the stove. Alan slid along the porch, flanking to the side. Another outlaw made the mistake of getting too close to the fence. Alan took him out clean, but the last 2 were smart. 1 went for the back door. Alan's eyes widened. Sarah, back window! She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the fire poker and stood just as the outlaw kicked in the kitchen door. Before he could raise his weapon, Sarah slammed the iron across his face. He went down hard. Mikey stared. She turned, panting. Sometime, she said, you protect what's yours. Outside, Alan took a hit to the shoulder. He stumbled, dropped to 1 knee, but fired again. The last outlaw fell, his gun spinning from his fingers. Then silence. Only the wind, and the distant call of a crow. Sarah ran to him. Blood soaked Alan's sleeve, but he waved her off. Just a scratch. She pulled a cloth from her apron and pressed it to the wound. You're an idiot, she whispered. He smiled. Always have been. Behind them, Mikey stood in the doorway, wide-eyed. You okay? Alan asked. The boy nodded slowly. Are you? Alan looked down at the blood, then up at the house still standing, the woman beside him, the boy in the doorway. I think I am, he said. Later, Dorsey and 2 deputies arrived. They found the bodies buried, the wounds bandaged, and Alan sitting on the porch, a blanket over his shoulder, Mikey asleep at his side. Well, hell, Dorsey muttered. You sure you don't want the badge back? Alan looked up. I already got what I came for. That night, Sarah came to him while the fire burned low. She sat beside him, took his hand. I almost forgot how to love you, she said. Alan looked at her. I never did. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. You stayed. So did you. It was the morning after the gunfight. The sun rose slowly over the hills, as if even the sky was holding its breath. The ranch was quiet, still, the kind of silence that only comes after something dangerous passes, but leaves its shadow behind. Alan sat on the porch, arm in a sling, watching Mikey chase a chicken that had gotten loose from the coop. The boy's laughter, rare and sudden, filled the air like music he didn't realize he'd missed. Sarah came outside with a mug of coffee, handed it to Alan, then sat beside him without a word. They didn't need to speak, not yet. That day, neighbors came, not many, just enough to surprise him. The widow Barnes brought fresh bread. Her son, who once called Alan a dirty breed, behind his back, helped hammer in a new gate. Dorsey came with spare ammunition and a grunt that might have been gratitude. No one said sorry, but they stayed. They worked. They brought their quiet offerings, not for forgiveness maybe, but something close to respect. Alan watched them fix what had been broken, plank by plank, and for the first time he didn't feel like a ghost walking through someone else's story. He felt like part of it. That evening he found Mikey behind the barn, whittling a piece of wood into what looked like a crooked horse. "You ever carved before?" Alan asked. The boy shook his head. "Just trying things." Alan knelt beside him. "Looks good." Mikey frowned. "No, it don't." "Not yet," Alan agreed. "But give it time. Everything worth anything starts ugly." Mikey looked up. "Is that how you felt when you came back?" Alan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I felt like a broken piece in the wrong puzzle." "You still feel that way?" Alan looked toward the house where Sarah moved behind the window light, her shadow brushing the curtains. "No," he said, "not anymore." Days passed, and with each one Alan built more than just fences. He repaired the roof with Sarah, helped Mikey train the mule to carry firewood, rebuilt the chicken coop from scratch, even planted a tree, his first. They worked until their backs ached and their hands were raw. But they didn't mind, because with every nail, every board, every shared task, the place began to feel less like hers and more like theirs. One afternoon, Mikey came running from the creek, soaking wet, holding a tin can filled with minnows. "They're back," he shouted. "Fish! Real ones!" Alan leaned over the porch rail. "I thought you said that stream was dead." "It was. Guess it got tired of waiting." Alan laughed, and Sarah, watching from the door, smiled like she hadn't in years. That night, Alan brought out a battered cigar box. Inside were his old things: a silver coin, a feather, a broken compass, and his sheriff's badge, tarnished and worn. He handed it to Mikey. The boy blinked. "Why me?" "Because this doesn't mean what it used to," Alan said. "It's just a piece of tin, but it came with weight, and I think you're strong enough to carry things." Mikey held it carefully. "Does this mean you're giving up?" Alan shook his head. "It means I'm finally settling in." Later, Sarah joined him by the fireplace. "You did it," she said. "Did what?" "Came back, stayed, built something." Alan looked around the room. There was warmth in the walls now, life in the floorboards, laughter in the corners. "I didn't do it alone," he said. She touched his face. "We didn't think we deserved a second chance," she whispered. "But maybe we were wrong." Alan leaned his forehead against hers. "We're here. That's enough." At the end of the week, Mikey asked the question no one had dared say aloud. "Am I going to stay here forever?" Alan looked at Sarah, then at the boy. "If you want to." Mikey's eyes welled. "I do." Sarah knelt in front of him. "Then this is your home." Alan cleared his throat. "And if you want, you can take our name." Mikey sniffed, nodded. "Can I still be called Mikey Darkwolf?" Alan smiled. "You can be called anything you want, son." Spring didn't just arrive in Hawksford, it settled in. The kind of spring that crept in slow, like someone unsure of their welcome. It started with the wildflowers, then the smell of wet soil, then the sound of river water trickling back to life. The valley took a breath, and so did the people who called it home. At the edge of that valley, in a crooked house with a red roof and a sagging porch, a boy was learning how to be part of something again. A woman was learning how to grieve without giving up. And a man who had once been run out of town was learning, finally, how to stay. Alan rose early, not from duty, not from habit, from peace, the kind that only comes after a man has stopped running from everything, including himself. He stepped outside barefoot, coffee steaming in his hand, watching the mist lift from the fields. The world was quiet except for the creak of the chicken coop and the slow, steady thud of a hammer behind the barn. Mikey was building something. "What is it this time?" Alan called. The boy looked up, pushing shaggy hair out of his eyes. "A post for the birdhouse." Alan raised an eyebrow. "That crooked thing still standing?" Mikey grinned. "It's got character." Alan chuckled. "So do you." Inside, Sarah stirred honey into oatmeal, humming an old lullaby no one had sung since her mother died. Her hair was pinned back, her dress simple. But there was light in her face again, faint but growing. She set 3 bowls on the table. No need to call for the others. They came on their own now. They sat, ate, talked in quiet tones. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It was just right. That afternoon, Alan took Mikey riding. Not to train, not to scout, just to ride. They rode past the creek, now full of clear water and minnows darting like tiny silver knives. Past Widow's Gulch, where old ghosts whispered but no longer shouted. Past the ridge where Alan had once stood alone, wondering if he'd be welcome again. "Do you miss it?" Mikey asked out of nowhere. "Miss what?" "Being sheriff." Alan thought about it. "I miss what it meant to people," he said. "I don't miss what it cost me." Mikey looked over, squinting against the sun. "You don't need a badge. You already protect people." Alan didn't answer. He just nudged his horse forward and kept riding. At home, Sarah was in the garden planting tomatoes. The sun warmed her back as she dug careful rows. The dirt felt good in her hands, like something steady, something true. She looked up as the 2 riders crested the hill. She didn't wave, didn't need to. They belonged here now. That evening, they sat around the fire pit out back. Sarah had made stew. Mikey passed around biscuits. Alan leaned back in his chair, listening more than speaking. "Tomorrow," Sarah said, "I was thinking we take the old wagon and pick up some paint. That front room still looks like a thundercloud." Alan raised an eyebrow. "You planning on redecorating me too?" Sarah smiled. "Already did." Mikey laughed so hard he dropped his biscuit. Alan grinned. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed without checking if anyone was watching. After dinner, Mikey pulled a folded piece of paper from his back pocket. "I've been writing," he said, suddenly shy. "Want to hear?" Sarah nodded. Alan leaned forward. The boy cleared his throat. There was a man who didn't know how to stay. He had wind in his boots and silence in his throat. People feared him because he didn't talk much, because he was different. But one day someone needed him, and he came back. Not because he was asked, but because it was right. He fought. He bled. He stayed. And somewhere along the way, he stopped being alone. He found a woman who never gave up. He found a boy who needed a home. And he became something better than sheriff. He became ours. The paper trembled in Mikey's hands. When he looked up, Sarah's eyes were glassy. Alan was very still. "Think it's good enough for school?" Mikey asked, suddenly unsure. Alan cleared his throat. "It's good enough for a library." Mikey beamed. Later that night, after Mikey had gone to bed, Alan and Sarah sat on the porch. They said little, just listened. To the owls, the creak of old boards, the wind in the trees. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah said softly, "how different things could have been if you'd stayed the first time?" "All the time." "Do you regret it?" Alan thought for a long while. "No," he said. "I regret not being ready, but I don't regret leaving, because I wouldn't have come back like this. I wouldn't have stayed." Sarah turned toward him. "You're not planning on leaving again, are you?" He shook his head. "I planted a tree, didn't I?" She smiled. "You did." 2 weeks later, the adoption papers arrived. Alan let Mikey open the envelope. The boy read the words out loud, slowly, carefully. "Michael Darkwolf, son of Alan Darkwolf, legal guardian and parent." He looked up. "So, it's real?" Alan smiled. "It was always real. Now it's just written down." Mikey tried to play it cool, but when he hugged Alan, he held on a little longer than usual. A few days later, the town hosted a small spring fair. Hawksford never did anything fancy. Just a few booths, some pies, and a fiddle band on hay bales. But that year, it felt different. Alan walked through the crowd, Sarah at his side, Mikey darting ahead with a slingshot and a candy apple. People nodded. A few smiled. One man tipped his hat, not as a formality, as respect. "You look uncomfortable," Sarah teased. "Feels strange being welcome." "You better get used to it." He took her hand. "I'll try." That night, the sky opened up. Stars spilled across the black like someone had shaken the heavens. Sarah lay beside Alan under a blanket on the porch, head on his chest. "You know," she said, "I think we're going to be okay." Alan looked down at her. "We already are. Some stories end with a gunshot. Others end with a goodbye. But the rare ones, the ones that stay with you, end with a choice. To stay, to build, to love again. This was never a story about revenge. It was a story about belonging, about finding your place, not because it was given to you, but because you chose to fight for it. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think a man becomes part of a place because of blood, or because of who stays beside him? Which moment in Alan's journey hit you the hardest? Leave us a comment, and don't forget to tell us where in the world you're watching from, because stories like this deserve to be shared and remembered. They said Dusty Hollow forgot its heroes as easily as it buried them. By the time Elias Boone turned 66, folks barely remembered he'd once worn blue. His coat was tattered now, not from war, but from years under sun and snow. He didn't beg, he didn't drink, he just wandered. A thin old man with a hollow stare, gathering scraps in alleys and speaking softly to the wind. Some called him the Quiet One. Most called him nothing at all. Each night he slept beneath different awnings. Each morning he rose with the sun, not from purpose but habit. A veteran of 3 bloody campaigns, Elias had once carried men from burning fields. Now he carried only silence. One frost-bitten morning, with hunger like nails in his gut and his coat barely stitched together, Elias stepped into Harper's Mercantile. He didn't come to steal, not in his heart, but he walked out with a day-old loaf tucked under his coat all the same. That's when everything changed, not because of what he took, but because of who remembered. The wind came down from the hills like a knife that morning, slicing through the brittle silence of Dusty Hollow. It rattled the wooden signs over shuttered shops and drove dust against the windows of Harper's Mercantile. Inside, old Mr. Harper was restocking shelves with the same mechanical rhythm he'd kept for 30 years. Biscuit tins, flour sacks, beans. Nothing ever changed much in Dusty Hollow, at least not until Elias Boone walked in. He wasn't a man folks noticed. That's what made him so easy to forget. Gaunt, gray-bearded, with a stoop in his shoulders and a limp in his left leg, he looked more like a drifter than a veteran. His coat was threadbare, sleeves patched with different colors, boots worn to the sole. He had the look of someone once built strong, now folded inward. But there was something in his walk, steady, measured, purposeful, something that still remembered structure. Mr. Harper glanced up as the bell over the door jingled, then frowned. "Morning," he said flatly, already uneasy. Elias didn't answer. He walked slowly down the far aisle, past salt pork and lamp oil, pausing only once to glance toward the wood-burning stove near the back. His hands hovered over a shelf of bread. Nothing fresh, just yesterday's leftovers, marked down and stiff. Then he looked back toward the counter. No one else in the store, no one watching. He slid one rye loaf into his coat, a quiet motion, practiced. But Harper had been expecting him. The old man had just installed a new mirror, a curved piece of polished metal high on the back wall, and he caught the theft as it happened. He slammed the drawer shut and reached for the desk bell. "Hey," he barked. "You stop right there." Elias froze. Harper didn't wait. He stormed out from behind the counter, eyes wide. "You think I'm blind? That loaf's not yours." Elias turned slowly, hands raised. The coat opened just enough to reveal the crust of the bread, poking from beneath a frayed lining. "I didn't mean harm," Elias said, voice low, calm. "Just needed something warm." "You think needing makes it yours?" Harper shouted. He was already stepping toward the store's front door, where the little bell still swayed on its hook. "I'm sending for Sheriff Boyd." Elias didn't run, didn't argue. He stood there like a statue in the wrong place at the wrong time. Within 10 minutes, the sheriff arrived, coat dusted with cold, boots thudding hard against the wooden floor. Boyd was a middle-aged man with a strong jaw and no patience for gray areas. "Caught him with it?" Boyd asked. Harper nodded. "Still warm." Elias stayed silent as the sheriff stepped in front of him. "You got anything to say for yourself?" "I'm tired," Elias said quietly. "And hungry." Boyd gave a tight nod, then reached for his cuffs. "All right then, let's go." Elias didn't resist. He held out his hands. The cold metal bit into his wrists like shame. As they stepped outside, a few townsfolk watched from porches and windows, muttering. Some had seen Elias around for years. Few knew his name. None knew his story. He was just another face blown in by wind and time. The jailhouse was small, 2 cells, 1 desk, and a potbelly stove that barely kept the frost from creeping in. Boyd led Elias inside, unlocked the far cell, and gestured. Inside, Elias stepped in, sat down on the cot without a word. "Trial will be in the morning," Boyd said. "Judge Whitlock comes in Tuesdays. You'll answer for the bread then." Elias nodded once. "Thank you, Sheriff." That gave Boyd pause. He looked at the old man, really looked, for the first time. There was no defiance, no fear, just resignation. That kind of stillness didn't come from petty crime. It came from something older, something earned. "You served?" Boyd asked suddenly, nodding to the tarnished chain around Elias's neck, half visible beneath his shirt. Elias gave a faint smile. "Long time ago." "Which side?" "Union, 27th Infantry, out of Illinois." Boyd nodded again, slower this time. "You fight at Vicksburg?" Elias looked up, and something flickered in his eyes. Not pride, not exactly. Just memory. "Yes, Sheriff." "I did." Boyd leaned back against the bars, folding his arms. "Huh. My uncle did too. Said it was hell." "It was," Elias said. "Most of us didn't come back whole." The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the clock above the sheriff's desk. Finally, Boyd sighed. "Well, that loaf's still property of Mr. Harper. You'll have to stand before the judge, same as anyone. But I'll make sure you've got something to eat tonight." Elias nodded. "That's more kindness than I expected." The next morning, the courtroom was nearly empty, just the way Dusty Hollow liked it. A few townsfolk lingered near the back, half curious. Mr. Harper sat near the front, arms folded, lips pressed tight. Sheriff Boyd leaned against a far wall. Elias Boone stood at the defense table, alone. Judge Whitlock entered with the gravity of a man who'd buried more than one version of himself. Silver-haired, tall, his long black coat still dusted with frost, he took the bench without a glance at the defendant. "State versus Elias Boone," the court clerk called. "Charge, petty theft." Mr. Harper was called to the stand. He told the story clearly, with an edge of personal offense. "Walked right in, like he owned the place. Took it. No shame about it." Whitlock raised an eyebrow. "And the value of this item? 4 cents, maybe 5. The judge turned to Elias. "Do you deny taking the bread?" "No, sir." "Do you plead guilty?" Elias met his gaze. "I do." Whitlock reached for the file. Standard papers. 1 page, 2 at most. But then, a smaller envelope slipped free. It hadn't been part of the official charge sheet. The judge hesitated, frowning as he unfolded it. Inside was a faded letter, folded 3 times, and tucked behind it, a photograph, creased at the corners, yellowed with age. He stared at it, and everything in him changed. He looked up. Really looked. "Mr. Boone," he said slowly, "where did you serve?" Elias hesitated. "Vicksburg, then Chattanooga, later Cold Harbor, carried wounded from the lines at Spotsylvania." The judge's hand trembled. "My brother," he whispered, he died at Cold Harbor. They said someone pulled him out of the fire." Elias didn't blink. "Not by name, sir, but I pulled many." For a long moment the courtroom was still. Dust floated in the shafts of light cutting through the windows. Then Judge Whitlock stood. Judges didn't stand in Dusty Hollow. Not for a stolen loaf. Not for men with no names. "We'll take a recess," he said, voice thick. "Defendant will remain in court." And without another word, he turned and walked to his chambers, the door swinging shut behind him. Elias sat quietly. He'd seen that look before. Long ago, when men bled out in their prime, and someone lived who wasn't supposed to. Judge Whitlock didn't speak to anyone for nearly half an hour. Inside his chambers, the morning light filtered through drawn curtains, casting long stripes across the dust-covered desk. The photograph still lay in front of him, half out of its envelope. His hand hovered over it like a man about to touch fire. He finally lifted it, a grainy battlefield image, taken by one of the early war photographers near the end of the siege at Cold Harbor. 3 men were in the frame. Two wounded, faces slack with pain, one kneeling between them, arms hooked under their shoulders, hauling them toward a field tent in the background. That man, tall, gaunt, with a face streaked in soot and blood, was unmistakably Elias Boone. Whitlock swallowed hard. He'd seen that face once before, not in person, but in the shattered expression of the young corporal who had delivered his brother's final effects. A torn satchel, a Bible, and a single folded note. "Tell my brother someone pulled me out." Said his name was Boone. That had been 1864. And all these years later, that name had come walking into his courtroom in a torn coat with frostbite on his knuckles and a 4-cent loaf hidden in his lining. Whitlock sat back, spine rigid. The law was clear. Theft was theft. But justice had its own pulse, and today it thudded like war drums in his chest. He pulled the service records closer, scanning the scribbled notes the sheriff had added overnight. Boone, Elias, Illinois, 27th. 3 major engagements. Commendation for battlefield evacuation. Wounded twice, honorably discharged. And then, nothing. No pension, no land claim, no contact. The last note simply read, "Widowed, 1870, wife, Margaret." The judge's jaw clenched. That name too meant something. Not to him, but to someone else in town. He pushed back his chair and rose. Some reckonings can't wait. Elias sat still as a statue while the courtroom murmured. The townsfolk whispered, glancing toward the closed chamber doors. Mr. Harper fidgeted in his seat, unsure whether to feel vindicated or upstaged. Sheriff Boyd leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching Elias with a mix of curiosity and respect he hadn't expected to feel when the arrest was made. Elias didn't move. He stared forward, hands folded, posture straight despite the ache in his shoulders. The courtroom door creaked open again, but it wasn't the judge who returned. It was a young woman, no more than 22, bundled in a thick brown coat, eyes wide as if she'd been galloping for miles. Her cheeks were red from cold and wind. She paused in the doorway, then spotted Elias and stepped forward slowly, like approaching a ghost. "Uncle Elias?" she said softly. Elias turned. For a moment he just looked at her, blinking as if the name didn't register. "It's me," she said again, voice cracking. "Rebecca, Margaret's niece." Elias's lips parted, but no sound came. "We've been looking for you for years," she said, moving closer. "After Aunt Maggie passed, you just vanished." His expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders shifted, the way a man stands when a weight finally moves. "I didn't want to be found," he whispered. Rebecca's eyes filled. "I know, but we never stopped hoping." He looked down, throat working. "You're grown," she nodded. "You look tired." He gave a soft huff of air, not quite a laugh. "You always said I looked tired, even when you were little." She smiled through her tears. "You always said I'd be trouble. Still might be." Their hands met briefly. Not an embrace, not yet, but contact, warmth, recognition. The judge returned a few minutes later, face pale but composed. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and looked out at the courtroom. "This hearing was scheduled to address a simple charge of petty theft," he began, "but it has become clear to me that nothing about this case is simple." He paused, letting the words settle. "The defendant, Mr. Elias Boone, is not merely a transient or a thief. He is a decorated veteran of the Union Army, a man who served with distinction across multiple battlefields, and, as I have now confirmed, someone who once carried my own brother to safety at the cost of his own injury." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Harper shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I confess," the judge continued, "that when Mr. Boone first stood before me, I saw only what years of hardship had left behind. I did not see the man. I saw the dust." He turned to Elias. "And for that, I am ashamed." Elias nodded once, solemn. "You're not the first." Judge Whitlock exhaled sharply, then straightened a stack of papers. "Sheriff, what do we know about Mr. Boone's circumstances?" Boyd stepped forward. "Sir, his military pension was never reinstated after 1871. Records got lost in a fire at the regional office in St. Louis. He never reapplied." The judge's brow furrowed. "Why not?" Elias's voice was steady. Because Maggie died, and after that, I didn't see the point. Whitlock was quiet for a moment. I have already sent a telegram to the Army Records Bureau. We will be correcting that oversight immediately, and I will personally speak to the State Claims Office in St. Louis regarding back payments. Another pause, then the judge spoke clearly. As for the theft charge, I find the defendant guilty as charged. A stunned silence fell. Mr. Harper sat up straighter, as if vindicated. But, the judge continued, given the extraordinary circumstances of Mr. Boone's service and the failure of the system that should have protected him, I hereby sentence him to time served and order his immediate release. Harper stood indignant. That man stole from me. Yes, Whitlock replied without raising his voice, and you'll be reimbursed tenfold by the state. You'll also have the honor of knowing your loaf of bread finally brought a good man home. The gavel fell. Court adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the wind had softened. Rebecca walked beside Elias, arm tucked gently through his. I have a little place up north, she said. Not much, but it's warm. You'd have your own room. He glanced sideways. You sure you want an old man for company? I'd take one who remembers how to carry people, she said softly, over half the men who talk loud and do nothing. He chuckled. Behind them, Sheriff Boyd caught up. Boone, he said, offering a small canvas sack. Brought you something. Elias opened it, a loaf of fresh bread from Harper's shelf. I paid for this one, the sheriff added. Elias nodded. That's the first one. I'll eat in peace. As the three walked away, a boy on a porch leaned toward his father and asked, Who's that man, Pa? The father watched them go. Someone we should have remembered sooner. 2 days after the trial, Dusty Hollow no longer spoke of Elias Boone with indifference. The whispers had shifted, from ridicule to reverence, from suspicion to silence. Where once he'd been just that old man who wandered, now folks said his full name with a kind of cautious respect, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Some still didn't understand what had changed. Others claimed they'd always known there was something different about him. But truth had a way of cutting through pride. The judge's words had hung in the air like smoke. I saw the dust, not the man. Now they all did. Elias stood just inside the small cabin Sheriff Boyd had arranged for him behind the jailhouse. An old structure once used to quarter traveling marshals, long forgotten and half collapsed until 2 ranch hands were sent by the judge to patch up the roof and fix the stove. It was nothing grand. A cot, a chair, a wood stove, and a narrow window facing the street. But to Elias, it was more comfort than he'd known in years. The bed didn't move with the wind. The walls didn't leak cold. And for the first time in a long while, he had a door that locked from the inside. Rebecca had come by that morning, carrying a sack of things. A clean blanket, 2 shirts, a comb, and a worn photograph of Margaret that made Elias's knees buckle when he saw it. She placed it gently on the shelf by the bed. I found it in Mama's things after she passed, she'd said, voice barely above a whisper. You wrote on the back. Said it was your favorite. Elias ran a trembling thumb over the inked words. Sunday morning, before the storm, still smiling. His throat tightened. Rebecca had hugged him then, not like someone offering pity, but like someone anchoring him back to the world. She didn't ask for stories, didn't press about the missing years, just stayed long enough to show she still cared. That, he realized, was enough. Later that afternoon, a knock came at the door. 3 sharp raps. Elias opened it slowly. Standing on the step was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a Union officer's coat, brass buttons catching the afternoon sun. His mustache was dusted with gray, but his posture was unmistakable. Military through and through. Colonel James Mason, the man said, offering a gloved hand. You probably don't remember me. Elias stared for a moment. Then, 2nd Company. Vicksburg. You lost 2 toes to frostbite and still refused to leave the line. Mason laughed, a deep, honest sound. So you do remember. They shook hands firmly. It wasn't a greeting, it was a seal, a promise between men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder while the world tried to kill them. I heard what happened in court, Mason said, stepping inside. I was in the area when Judge Whitlock's telegram reached me, rode 2 towns over just to get it. Elias nodded. Didn't think anyone still looked out for the likes of me. Mason grew serious. You saved my life, Boone. Carried me half a mile on your back while cannon fire tore up the road behind us. And you weren't even supposed to be on duty that day. Elias said nothing. I know what happened after. Maggie's passing, the pension records, the silence, all of it. Mason sighed, removing his hat. But we failed you. You should never have had to crawl back into the dust to survive. Elias looked away. Wasn't about pride, just couldn't face what was left. Mason placed a thick envelope on the table. This is for you. Partial back pay, signed off by the state office. There's more coming, and I'm working with the Veterans Registry to ensure you're fully reinstated. They're naming you as the point contact for others in the area. Elias raised an eyebrow. Others? Mason nodded. You're not the only one who fell through the cracks. There are others, men sleeping in barns, under bridges, or worse. You're the first step to finding them. Elias looked down at his hands. The calluses hadn't healed. The scars never would. I'm no leader, Colonel. Mason's voice softened. You're not meant to lead, just to stand again. That'll be enough. By week's end, a short article appeared in the Dusty Hollow Gazette. War hero found in courtroom, Elias Boone's story shakes town awake. The editor had been in the room during the hearing and wrote every word himself. None of that second-hand gossip. He printed Elias's war record, the photo of him carrying 2 wounded men, and even Margaret's name. A final line read, he lived without asking. Let us now give without waiting. Donations started at the church the next Sunday. A passing hat gathered more than $200 in coin and bills. Rebecca brought in 2 old trunks of clothes from her homestead. The blacksmith offered to fix Elias's boots for free. Even Mr. Harper, red-faced and avoiding Elias's gaze, sent a fresh loaf every morning, wrapped in cloth and left silently on the cabin step. Elias never asked for any of it, but he accepted it, because now he finally understood. Accepting kindness didn't erase pride. It meant someone still saw value in you. One evening, Sheriff Boyd invited Elias to a gathering behind the saloon. A handful of old veterans from neighboring towns were meeting, drinking coffee instead of whiskey, talking about back pay, missing records, and empty chairs at supper tables. Elias stood quietly at first, listening. Then one man, a wiry fellow missing his left arm, asked, So what did they call you, back in the service? Elias shrugged. Boone. The man smiled. Nah, I mean your call name. Elias hesitated. Ghost. That got a few laughs. The man leaned in. Why Ghost? Because I always came back, no matter the fire. And for the first time in years, Elias smiled, not just with his lips, but with something deeper, something that felt like peace. It wasn't the bread nor the trial, nor even the war record that changed Dusty Hollow. It was the name, Elias Boone, a name that now traveled from porch steps to saloon corners, a name that once vanished into wind and hunger, now spoken with weight, the kind of weight only earned through silence, sacrifice, and survival. Some still said it in whispers, others with pride, but none could say they didn't know it anymore. By the following week, Judge Whitlock summoned Elias back to the courthouse, not as a defendant, but as an honored guest. I know you're not one for ceremonies, the judge said, rising from behind his desk, but sometimes a man's silence isn't enough. The town needs to see. Elias adjusted the clean shirt Rebecca had brought him days before. It still itched. What exactly are we showing them? Whitlock opened a cabinet and pulled out a frame. Inside, a certificate stamped and signed by the Veterans Affairs Office in St. Louis. Your full reinstatement. Pension, back pay, medical aid. All of it, official now. He laid it on the desk like an offering. But more than that, we're founding a local chapter of the Veterans Welfare Society, first one this side of the Rockies. Elias stared at the paper. And you want me to what? Lead it? Whitlock smiled. Number just sit in the front row. The rest we'll take from there. The day of the dedication was cold but clear. The townsfolk gathered near the steps of the courthouse, bundled in coats and shawls, some holding small flags, others just curiosity. Sheriff Boyd stood beside the mayor, who rarely showed his face outside the land office, and even Mr. Harper was there, hat clutched to his chest, eyes forward. Elias arrived with Rebecca on his arm. He walked slower than most, but stood straighter than any man there. When the townsfolk saw him, the silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even the children who didn't understand the moment instinctively fell quiet. Colonel Mason took the makeshift stage first. He wore full-dress blues, polished to a shine. I served beside Staff Sergeant Elias Boone during the war, watched him pull men out of fire, carry wounded across ravines, and once tie off a wound on his own leg so he could keep dragging another man to safety. He looked over the crowd. We called him Ghost, not because he haunted us, but because nothing could stop him. Now we finally see the man behind the legend. Then Judge Whitlock stepped forward. I sat on this bench for 17 years, he said. I have read cases, sentenced men, dismissed others, but I have never seen a case like this one. His gaze swept the crowd. Because this wasn't a case, it was a reckoning. Not for Elias Boone, for us. He reached behind the podium and lifted a second frame, a sketch in charcoal done by the town's blacksmith's wife, who had once dreamed of studying art in New York. The portrait showed Elias not as he was now, but as he had been. Uniformed, eyes forward, carrying another man on his back, smoke in the background. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Some heroes never stopped fighting. They just stopped being seen." A hush fell over the gathering. Then the mayor spoke the final words. By the authority of this town, we name this building's East Wing the Elias Boone Memorial Room, a space for veterans, for stories, and for silence, for those we forgot and those we won't again. Applause broke slowly, then louder. Elias didn't smile, not in the way others expected, but his eyes softened, his jaw unclenched. For the first time in decades, he felt seen. After the ceremony, Elias stood near the back steps of the courthouse, away from the crowd. Rebecca joined him with 2 cups of cider. "Your hands are shaking," she said softly. He looked down at his fingers. "I'm not used to this many people looking without suspicion." "They're not looking with suspicion, Uncle," she said. "They're looking with thanks." He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled something from his coat. A photograph, folded carefully inside oilcloth. He handed it to her. "Margaret's wedding portrait. You hold on to it for a while," he said. "Safer with you." Rebecca opened it gently, her breath catching. "You sure?" He nodded. "She'd like knowing it's with someone warm." That evening, Elias returned to the little cabin. A letter waited on his cot, sealed with the crest of the governor's office. He opened it carefully, candlelight flickering. Inside, a formal statement, a statewide initiative to review and recover all unclaimed veteran pensions post-war. His case had opened the door. At the bottom, handwritten in ink, "We thank you not only for your service, but for reminding us how to serve in return." He folded the letter once, laid it beside Margaret's photo, and stared out the small window. The street below was quiet. The lanterns flickered gold on wooden planks. Somewhere, children were laughing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel outside of it all. He felt home. The cabin no longer smelled like cold stone and damp wood. It smelled like cedar, ash, and something faintly sweet. Cider from Rebecca, bread from Mr. Harper's wife, and fresh linen from the church women who'd insisted Elias deserved better than threadbare wool. The space still bore its age in creaking boards and crooked nails, but it had become something else now. It had become a home. Elias didn't say that out loud. He hardly said anything at all. But each morning when he lit the stove before the frost climbed in through the cracks, he stood a little straighter. When he walked into town, he no longer kept his eyes on the ground. And when someone tipped their hat or offered him a seat, he didn't wave them off. He simply nodded. A man relearning the weight of being seen. Sheriff Boyd visited most afternoons, sometimes with mail, sometimes with news, sometimes just with a pipe and quiet company. On this day, he came with both, a folded letter and a small tobacco pouch. "You got another one," he said, handing the envelope over. "Came by courier this time. No stamp, no return. That means someone important." Elias broke the wax seal and read slowly. The letter was from General Theodore Richards, a name he hadn't heard in 2 decades. "Dear Sergeant Boone," it began, My son, Lieutenant Andrew Richards, is alive today because of your actions outside Chattanooga in '64. Though you never took credit, he's spoken your name every birthday since. I want you to know the debt we owe is not just one of life, but of legacy. If ever you need anything, you need only send word. At the bottom, a note in different ink. P.S. I've instructed a sculptor to contact you. Don't argue, you've earned it. Elias stared at the letter for a long time, then folded it neatly and tucked it beside the others. Dozens now stacked in a pine box near the stove. Letters from men he'd saved, from wives and sons and cousins of men he hadn't. Some thanked him, some apologized for forgetting. A few simply wrote, "You carried me. Now it's my turn." The box had become heavier than his pack ever was during the war, but he carried it all the same. A week later, the artist arrived. Not some stiff-collared city man, but a soft-spoken widow named Miriam Tate who sketched in a journal more than she spoke. She asked Elias to sit for her on the church porch, near where the new Veterans Hall was being constructed. "I don't want it to be perfect," she said. "I want it to feel earned." Elias nodded. "I've got no use for perfect." As she drew, townsfolk wandered by, some pausing to tip their hats, others standing quietly as if unsure whether they should speak. No one interrupted, and Miriam worked quickly, her pencil flying across the page like she'd waited years for this face. "You don't smile much," she remarked after a while. "Never learned how to do it without Margaret," Elias replied. There was silence. Then, "Well, maybe this time you let her smile through you." He didn't answer, but his jaw eased. That Sunday, the church bell rang, longer than usual. The town had called for a veterans gathering, not just for Dusty Hollow's handful, but for any man within 3 days' ride. They came in slowly, arriving with dust on their boots and hesitation in their eyes. Some wore remnants of their old uniforms. Others came barehanded, with nothing but the weight they carried. By noon, there were nearly 24 seated in the pews. Elias sat at the front, coat freshly brushed, boots polished by the blacksmith's apprentice, who refused payment. Beside him, Colonel Mason. Behind him, Boyd, Rebecca, and a dozen children who'd taken to calling him Mr. Boone with a strange kind of affection. Judge Whitlock stood at the altar. "We have failed many," he began, voice low but firm. "But today we begin remembering. Not with parades, not with medals, but with presence." He turned to Elias. "Would you speak?" Elias rose slowly. Every step up to the altar felt like crossing open field under fire. Not from danger, but from memory. He looked out at the faces, some wrinkled, some still young, all watching. "I didn't come here to be seen," he began. "I came because I was tired, hungry, cold. I took bread because I thought I was the last one left who remembered who I used to be." He paused. "I was wrong." He gestured to the men before him. "We are not lost, just waiting to be remembered, and maybe, more importantly, to remember each other." There was no applause, only stillness, the kind of stillness that honored the weight of silence. That evening, Elias sat on the steps outside his cabin. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Rebecca sat beside him, handing over a cup of tea. "You know," she said gently, "this little town might just outgrow you." Elias chuckled softly. "Let it try." She glanced at the stack of letters by his boot. "You ever think about writing back?" He took a long sip. "Sometimes, but I think maybe just standing here, where they can find me, says enough." She leaned against his shoulder, and for the first time, Elias didn't flinch at the contact. In the distance, the church bell rang again. Not for mourning, not for warning, but for memory. And this time, it rang for the living. The town square had never held this many people. Not for Founders Day, not even the infamous cattle fire of '79. They came from all corners of the territory, veterans and townsfolk, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and children tugging at their mothers' sleeves, asking who the man in the statue was. The answer was simple now. Elias Boone. The stonework had gone up overnight. Miriam Tate's sketch brought to life by a sculptor from Helena, who refused payment after reading Elias's story in the Gazette. It stood 10 feet tall, cast in local stone, chisel marks still fresh. Elias wasn't posed as a hero atop a horse or aiming a rifle. He stood upright, coat button, one hand gripping a lantern held at his side. The other rested gently on the shoulder of a faceless, crouching soldier. A younger man, a representation of all he'd carried. Beneath the statue, the words read, "He asked for nothing, but gave everything, and still stood tall." Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, hat in hand. He wore his uniform coat. Not because it fit perfectly, and it didn't, but because Margaret had once patched the inside pocket herself, and he felt closest to her when he wore it. Rebecca stood beside him, her gloved fingers laced into his sleeve. On his other side, Colonel Mason adjusted his spectacles and whispered, "If this were a battlefield, you'd be the one giving orders." Elias gave a quiet huff of breath. "Then I'd tell everyone to go home and rest." "But you didn't," Mason replied. "You stood again, when it mattered." As the mayor gave his short speech, children climbed onto their father's shoulders to get a better look at the monument. The church bell tolled once, twice, then fell silent. A signal. Elias stepped forward. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. He moved with the slow dignity of a man unaccustomed to praise, each step echoing in the wooden planks of the platform. When he reached the statue, he placed a single object at its base, a folded piece of cloth wrapped in oilskin. Margaret's photograph. He didn't say anything, just touched the stone at knee level, then stood back. He didn't need to speak. His silence was the anthem. In the days that followed, strangers passed through Dusty Hollow not just for trade or shelter, but to see the man who lived in the little cabin near the jailhouse. The man whose statue now stood between the bank and the feed store, who still rose with the sun and walked with quiet purpose down to the mercantile. Mr. Harper, now red with contrition, insisted on handing him the morning bread himself. "No charge," he always said, "just thanks." Elias never corrected him. That winter, Elias began visiting the schoolhouse every Thursday. Not to teach, not exactly, but to speak, softly, plainly. He told the children about marching through snow with wet boots, about writing letters with shaking hands, about the silence that follows a cannon blast and the names you never forget. He never dramatized it, never made war noble, but he made memory sacred. One day, a boy named Thomas raised his hand and asked, "Were you scared, Mr. Boone?" Elias smiled faintly. "Most days, bravery doesn't mean you aren't. It means you stand up anyway." Another day, a little girl handed him a drawing, a man in a blue coat holding a lantern. "It's you," she said, lighting the way. Elias folded it gently, slipped it into his coat, and walked home with new weight in his chest, the good kind. On the first spring morning, as the grass returned to the hills and the crows no longer circled the rooftops, Elias stood beneath his statue before dawn. No crowd, no ceremony, just him. He lit a small lantern, the same one from his days in the field, battered but functional, and placed it at the base of the statue, for the ones still wandering, for the ones not yet seen, for the ghosts who carried more than they could hold. That evening, Rebecca found him in the cabin with the fire low and the pine box of letters open beside him. He wasn't reading, just sitting. "Thinking about moving?" she asked. Elias shook his head slowly. "Just remembering." She walked over and handed him a folded piece of parchment. "The governor's office is renaming the Veterans Charter. They're calling it the Boone Initiative." He blinked. "Why?" "Because it started with you." Elias stared into the fire. After a long moment, he said, "Then make sure it doesn't end with me." Months later on Memorial Day, Elias Boone stood at the edge of the crowd once more. This time, others took the podium. Colonel Mason, Judge Whitlock, Sheriff Boyd. Children recited poems. A teenage boy played a solemn tune on a fiddle, and when the time came for Elias to speak, he simply tipped his hat to the crowd, stepped back, and let the silence speak for him. As he did, veterans in the audience, young, old, broken, proud, rose to their feet. Some saluted, some simply stood. And Elias? He nodded, back straight, lantern light in his eyes, as if to say, "I see you now, and I am no longer alone." Some names fade with time, but other, like Elias Boone's, burn steady, like a lantern in the dark. If this story moved you, take a moment to remember the silent heroes around us. Not just those in uniforms, but those carrying quiet burdens no one sees. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to know where this story found you. And if you believe kindness is never too late, hit the like button, share this video, and help us keep these stories alive. Because sometimes the ones who ask for nothing leave behind the most.